Let's preview the St. Louis Cardinals for 2026 up next on Fantasy Baseball Today. Welcome to On the Beat, our mini team preview series here at Fantasy Baseball Today. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Jeff Jones, who covers the St. Louis Cardinals for the Belleville News Democrat. Make sure to give him a follow on X at JMJones and on Blue Sky at jmjones.bsky.social. Let's start with the Cardinals offseason here. Heimblum is in, and it kind of feels like they're tearing things down a little bit. They traded Sonny Gray to the Red Sox for Richard Fitts, Brandon Clark, a player to be named later. They traded Wilson Contreras also to the Red Sox for Hunter Dobbins and two prospects. They recently traded Nolan Arenado to the D-backs for right-handed pitcher Jack Martinez. Essentially a salary dump there. They signed Dustin May to a one-year deal. They signed reliever Ryan Stanek to a one-year deal as well. And as of recording, it sounds like they're still listening to offers for Brendan Donovan. I myself would bank on him being traded before spring training or maybe before the season starts, but 2026 could be a bit of a rough one. They look like they have their eye on the future. Lots of interesting prospects coming as well. What do you think about this offseason so far and the direction of the Cardinals moving forward?
Yeah, Heimblum is in and everyone else seemingly is out. I think that when the Cardinals went into this winter, they were committed to at least choosing a direction and going that way. And they have been pretty forthright about what that looks like and sort of what they need to do to get there, other than Bill DeWitt Jr. sort of in a kind of funny moment from the Fan Fest over the weekend, pointing out that, well, he wouldn't call it a rebuild. He would call it a build, which, hey, he signs the checks, I guess. But, it's been a decided winner of direction. It has been a winner where it's very clear that they are not putting competitive success in the short term ahead of whatever they might build for the long term. And they seem ready to accept the consequences of that. It's been a couple generations here in St. Louis since we've seen this kind of downturn in the competitive cycle. So whether the reality of that is something that fans are willing to kind of absorb, whether the organization is prepared for that, I guess we'll see.
One of the big fantasy questions we have for the Cardinals this upcoming season is around Ivan Herrera, who last year obviously dealt with some injuries and didn't get as much time at catcher. He actually lost catcher eligibility in fantasy baseball, so now we're left trying to figure out how much is he going to play catcher this season, because we need 5 to 10 games for him to regain that catcher eligibility. So they obviously have a couple other catchers here, a few young ones that they want to work in as well. How often do you think Ivan Herrera will catch this upcoming season?
I think in terms of fantasy eligibility, you probably are actually in a pretty good spot there, because Ali Marmol over the weekend was asked about what Ivan Herrera's work needs to look like in spring, and is one spring training a long enough time to determine whether or not he's going to be able to catch for them. And he sort of conceded, that's probably not long enough. And so what that told us is that this work with Herrera is going to continue into the season, that you should expect him to get at least some games, in March and April behind the plate to kind of work through that and figure that out. And, the Cardinals certainly, because of what they're doing with the roster, don't have the kind of depth that you would need, or that at least you would be concerned about in terms of carrying 3 catchers. They can do that comfortably because they just don't have that many utility bats otherwise in the system that fill those spots. So I would expect Herrera to start the season at least in the catching rotation, and assuming he's healthy, maybe that looks like 3 weeks or a month before they make a solid determination there, but definitely enough that you would see a decent helping of him behind the plate.
All right, that is music to our ears, because we know how great of a hitter he is. Now we need him to have that catcher eligibility for fantasy baseball purposes. Let's take a quick break, and we'll be back right after this.
When you need your sports news all the time,
we've got breaking news to bring to you.
CBS Sports HQ gives you a snapshot of all the sports that matter to you. When you need your sports in a snap, find it on CBS Sports HQ, streaming free anywhere you are.
Welcome back in Fantasy Baseball Today. We are previewing the St. Louis Cardinals for this upcoming season with Jeff Jones, who covers the team for the Belleville News Democrat. Let's get into a sleeper for this upcoming season. Jeff, who do you have on the Cardinals?
Yeah, it's been a good couple of years here now where the Cardinals have done what they can to give Nolan Gorman some opportunities at the plate. Obviously, he's had the kind of power tool that they don't really have elsewhere in the system, and they've been willing to kind of push for that. But even after 1,200 at-bats, hasn't had the kind of consistency you might hope for. So there's definitely a lot of variance with Nolan Gorman. But having traded Nolan Arenado and listening to the way the team is talking about breaking up playing time at third base, I think he's going to have a really decent shot to get a lot of starts there, especially on the long side of the platoon. So, if you're a believer that Gorman can get back to that sort of stance where maybe the strikeout rate isn't 35%, maybe it's down closer to 30, and that gets you access to another dozen or so homers per year. He's definitely a guy who can give you some depth power, but there is always going to be that risk that the whiff rate is just going to be too high for him to get consistent enough playing time.
Let me follow up there because obviously JJ Wetherholt, huge prospect in the organization, and they traded away Arenado. I still think there's a good chance they trade away a Brendan Donovan. It feels like there's a real opportunity for JJ Wetherholt this spring to maybe win a job and be up on opening day. To that point, I've also heard a little pushback from Cardinals fans that maybe they keep him down past the Super 2 deadline and try to gain more years of control for the long term. So what are you hearing? What do you think about JJ Wetherholt's chances of actually being up on opening day?
So, there's a couple of things there, right? I think that even if Brendan Donovan is still on the roster when spring training starts or when opening day happens, that there is already room enough for JJ Wetherholt to be on the opening day roster, whether that's at second or at third. I don't know that they have hashed that out entirely yet. Ali Marmol in the past has said that he views Brendan Donovan as a second baseman, but if Weatherholt obviously is a longer-term priority for them, right, and if that's where he fits best, then maybe Donovan is the guy who slides over to third. But either way, there are going to be at-bats for Weatherholt, and he is definitely going to have an opportunity. In terms of what it means for service time and all that stuff, I think the Cardinals, where they are at right now, kind of in the very beginning of this rebuild process, number one, frankly, probably value that prospect promotion pick that they could conceivably get if Weatherholt were to win Rookie of the Year more than they would the extra time of control. Because the other thing to consider too is I would be surprised if all things go the way the Cardinals want them to go with JJ Wetherholt. They're going to want to get him signed to an extension that's going to extend beyond those years of control anyway. And so there's not really a reason either way that matters for them, right? Because if Weatherholt struggles enough that he needs to be held down, then the service time issue takes care of itself. But if he's good enough that he's pushing and he's on the opening day roster and he's a contributor offensively, then I don't think they're going to be worried about that extra year of service, especially when you consider kind of the upside for them, not only in getting after that pick, but also in making sure things kind of stay copacetic with a guy who is probably their most important position player in the organization right now.
Yeah, JJ Wetherholt, huge season in the minors last year. Honestly, we were kind of pining for him to get called up in September, right? He was performing so well at AAA. So we'll see how he does in spring training. This is a decision that many other teams have had to make is, do I have that big prospect up on opening day, try and go for that, draft pick compensation, or do I maybe hold him down till later in the season and, hold on to more years of control? Also, we have a new CBA that's coming up next offseason, right, and we don't even know what this is going to look like. So we'll see what happens there pertaining to prospects. What about a breakout for the Cardinals this upcoming season? Who do you have there?
Last year when they traded Ryan Helsley at the deadline, it became pretty clear that Riley O'Brien was going to get a lot of priority looks in the back end of the bullpen, was going to pitch a lot of ninth innings, and did so and was super effective. O'Brien is a classic guy where you watch him pitch and the stuff looks filthy and you wonder how he got to be 30 years old and doesn't have a long major league track record. It's because he's been hurt, right? He's just been so hurt for so long that it's been hard for him to build that consistency. But, if the Cardinals go into the season, even with Romero, but also if Romero is a guy who gets traded here before the start of spring training, which is entirely possible, there's not going to be real competition for O'Brien at the back end of the bullpen. So even on a team that's not going to win many games, he is going to be the guy who should probably get the vast majority of the save looks. And so from that perspective, especially when you consider kind of what he did on a rate basis last season, that's a guy who might last till later rounds in a draft. But if you want a closer who can handle that, I think that Riley O'Brien would be a really interesting opportunity for that.
Yeah, you look at what he did last season. I mean, the stuff is disgusting. He's got a 98-mile-per-hour sinker. He's got a curveball with a whiff rate over 50%. He has a slider that does a good job of getting outs as well. So it seems like everything is there. Obviously, has to button up the control a little bit. The walks were too high, but the stuff is there. He gets a lot of ground balls, and he looked pretty good in the role last season. So looks like perhaps Riley O'Brien carrying that over and looking like the closer heading into this season. Big thanks to Jeff Jones, who covers the Cardinals for the Belleville News Democrat. Make sure to check out his work and give him a follow on X at JM Jones and on Blue Sky at jmjones.bsky.social. For more extensive fantasy baseball coverage, listen to our full-length podcast, Fantasy Baseball Today, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Thanks for listening to our On the Beat team preview series, and we will be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye.